She handed me a $20 bill like I was invisible. Not because she was kind, but because she thought I was nothing. We were standing inside a glass-walled venue dripping with money, power, and old names. My family was celebrating her engagement to my brother. Everyone thought this night would save them. She leaned in, smiled sweetly, and said, "Buy yourself something before the food's gone." So I took the money, I thanked her, and I let her believe the lie. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every smile in that room was already recorded, and the moment she touched my hand, her future quietly ended. I've always been the useful one in my family. Not the favorite, not the pride, the reliable one, the one who paid on time, showed up early, stayed late, and fixed things quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. I was the child who learned early that love in our house wasn't freely given, it was earned, usually through sacrifice. My name is Eleanor Wright, and long before that night at the Harlow Hotel, I had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a narrow brick townhouse that looked impressive from the outside and hollow once you lived inside it. My father, Richard Wright, had once been someone people recognized, mid-level finance executive. Sharp suits, firm handshake, a name that used to open doors. My mother, Lydia, curated her identity the way other people curated art, carefully, selectively, and always for public consumption. Then there was my older brother, Ethan. Ethan was promise. Ethan was potential. Ethan was the child everyone waited on. The son my parents believed would restore what they felt slipping away. When Ethan failed quietly, repeatedly, it was never framed as failure. It was bad timing, unfair bosses, people who didn't see his vision. And me, I was the contingency plan. I learned this lesson at 14, when my college savings fund quietly vanished to cover one of Ethan's business ideas. At 18, when my parents praised my independence because it meant they didn't have to help me. At 22, when I paid my own tuition in full and my mother told people I was very self-sufficient. As if it were a compliment and not an abdication, I built my life anyway. I studied hospitality management, then pivoted into operations. I worked my way up from assistant floor manager to regional director, learning contracts, logistics, people. I learned how money moved, not the flashy version, but the real one. Margins, risk, accountability. I started a boutique hospitality group at 28, small at first, then profitable, then respected. By 32, I owned 3 venues outright. No one in my family asked how. They only noticed when they needed something. The one person who did see me was my grandmother, Margaret Wright. She lived 2 floors below us growing up. In a rent-controlled apartment, she refused to leave, even when my parents begged her to upgrade. She wore the same gold watch every day, an Art Deco piece she bought for herself after her first promotion as a bookkeeper in the 1,960 seconds. This, she once told me, pressing it into my palm when I was 16, is what independence looks like. It ticks whether anyone's watching or not. She was the only one who asked about my work, the only one who told me I didn't owe anyone my exhaustion. When she died, she left me that watch and a quiet understanding that I would need it one day. Ethan had a spare key to her apartment. That detail will matter later. The first time I heard the name Maris Calloway was 3 months before the engagement party. Ethan came home for Sunday dinner buzzing with excitement, like a man who thought his luck had finally turned. He showed us pictures, Maris smiling effortlessly, Maris on yachts, Maris at charity galas. He talked about her family like they were a passport. They're established, he said. Real money. Generational. My mother nearly cried. My father leaned forward in his chair like gravity had shifted. I said nothing. I watched the way Ethan avoided specifics, the way every achievement was vague. Consulting, international investments, private ventures, No names, no structures, just confidence and buzzwords. I'd spent 10 years in rooms where real money talked softly and paperwork spoke louder. This wasn't that. So I did what I've always done when something feels off. I checked. I hired Jonah Reese, a former federal compliance auditor who now specialized in financial due diligence. I told him to look into the Calloway family Maris, her parents, their businesses. I gave him discretion and a deadline. He came back in 9 days. The report wasn't dramatic. That was the scariest part. No loud scandals. No tabloid mess. Just patterns. Shell companies layered over shell companies. Investments that existed on paper but never produced assets. Funds that moved too quickly, too cleanly, through too many jurisdictions. Jonah used one phrase that stayed with me. They don't build, they extract. I took the report to a federal contact I'd met years earlier during a licensing dispute, a financial crimes liaison named Daniel Ross. He listened. He asked careful questions. Then he asked one of his own. Are they asking your family for money? He leaned back, exhaled, and said, then we may have a problem and an opportunity. That was the moment I understood what my role had always been preparing me for. Not saving my family, documenting the truth about them. By the time the engagement party was scheduled, the Calloways were already under quiet investigation. Jurisdictional issues, timing problems, the kind of case that collapses without one clean, undeniable act on U.S. soil. They needed a transaction. They needed consent. They needed someone underestimated enough to step forward without suspicion. They needed me and my family. They were so focused on what the Calloways represented: status, rescue, validation, that they never asked why I was suddenly so agreeable, so quiet, so helpful. They didn't notice when I offered to host the party. They didn't ask how I paid for it. They were just relieved someone else had handled the details. As always, that night at the Harlow Hotel wasn't the beginning of my betrayal. It was the end of my compliance. And the first time I stopped fixing things quietly. Once the engagement was official, the pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. Polite at first, reasonable, almost flattering. Maris started calling me family within days. Not warmly, strategically. Every conversation came wrapped in praise that felt rehearsed. You're so competent. Eleanor. You're the practical one. Right, you understand numbers better than Ethan ever could. Each compliment carried weight. Each one nudged me closer to a role I hadn't agreed to play. My parents followed quickly. My mother called more often, her tone lighter than it had been in years. My father started asking my opinion at dinner, something he hadn't done since I was a teenager. Ethan texted me late at night, nervous energy spilling through his messages. They're talking about an opportunity, he wrote. Just ideas right now. No pressure. There was always pressure. The Calloways invited us to private dinners, carefully chosen restaurants where the menus had no prices and the waitstaff spoke in murmurs. They talked endlessly about expansion, about international markets, about how rare it was to be invited into something so exclusive. They never explained the structure. When I asked questions, Maris smiled like I'd asked something quaint. Oh, it's complicated, she'd say lightly. But that's why you want experienced people handling it. Experienced people never object to transparency. That's something I learned building my company. The first real line was crossed during a Sunday brunch at my parents' house. We were halfway through mimosas when Maris casually mentioned how expensive wedding planning had become. Venues, deposits, travel. Her parents, she said, were stretched thin because of temporary liquidity issues. My mother stiffened. My father frowned. Ethan looked panicked. And then, like it had been rehearsed, Maris turned to me. You're so good with budgeting, she said. You probably understand how these things work better than we do. I felt every eye at the table shift toward me. I don't see how that involves me, I replied evenly. There was a pause, just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Well, Ethan said carefully, you are in a better position than the rest of us right now. There it was. Not a request. A statement. They weren't asking if I wanted to help. They were reminding me that I was expected to. I declined. Calmly. Politely. I said my finances were tied up in long-term investments. I said weddings were expensive and boundaries were important. No one argued. They didn't need to. The pressure just changed shape. After that, the calls came later at night. The language softened. It's just temporary. You'd get it back quickly. You know Ethan means well. This could really stabilize the family. Maris began treating me like a problem to be solved. She complimented my independence while subtly framing it as selfishness. She joked about how some people were so guarded with money they forgot what loyalty looked like. At dinner one night, she laughed and said, Eleanor would never take a risk like this. She's too careful. The table laughed with her. I smiled. Inside, something hardened. Then came the documents. Maris emailed me a sleek pitch deck charts. Projections. Glossy renderings of developments that didn't exist. I recognized the formatting immediately. Template-driven. Generic language. Inflated returns with no supporting data. I forwarded it to Jonah. He replied with one line. This is predatory. The moral line snapped the following week. Ethan came to my office unannounced. He looked smaller than usual. Nervous. Hands fidgeting. They need a founding investor, he said. Just one more. Someone stable. I said nothing. They said if we don't move soon, the opportunity disappears. Still nothing. Then he said the thing I will never forget. They asked if you'd be willing to front the capital just until the next round closes. Front. Not invest. Not partner. Front. I laughed once. Short. Disbelieving. You want me to give strangers 6 figures because they promised you a lifestyle. They're not strangers, he snapped. They're my family now. And just like that, the truth surfaced. I wasn't his sister. I was his backup plan. I told him no. Firmly, clearly, without apology. He didn't yell. He looked relieved. That scared me more than anger would have, because it meant he'd already accepted the idea of sacrificing me. From that point on, the manipulation became bolder. Maris stopped pretending to like me. She began criticizing my work ethic, my caution, my lack of ambition. She made comments in front of my parents about how I was comfortable being small. My mother stopped defending me altogether. My father avoided eye contact. They'd made their choice. They were willing to let me be used as long as it kept the illusion alive. That was the moment I stopped trying to protect them from what was coming. I began documenting everything. Every text. Every email. Every sideways comment. Every meeting invitation framed as family time that quietly turned into financial pressure. I forwarded it all to Daniel Ross. He didn't sugarcoat his response. They're escalating, he said, and they think you're weak enough to fold. I smiled when he said it, because underestimation was exactly what I needed. By the time the engagement party approached, the Callaways were confident. Too confident. They believed they'd already won, that the money would come from somewhere, and that someone would clean up the mess. They never considered that the person they were tightening the strings around had already slipped the knot. They thought they were squeezing me into compliance. What they were really doing was giving me leverage, and they had no idea how close they were to crossing the final line. The decisive act of exclusion didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came wrapped in politeness. 3 days before the engagement party, my mother called me while I was reviewing vendor contracts in my office. Her voice was tight, overly careful, the way it got when she'd already made a decision and didn't want to argue about it. We've finalized the seating, she said. Just logistics. I already knew. Still, I let her speak. You'll be at the end table, she continued, closer to the service corridor. It just makes more sense. Maris's family has specific expectations. Expectations. I pictured the room immediately. I'd approved the layout myself weeks earlier. The end table wasn't just peripheral, it was isolating. Outside the conversational flow, where staff passed through, where people placed coats and handbags without asking, "You'll still be included." My mother added quickly, "Of course, we just didn't want things to feel awkward." For whom? I asked her that. She didn't answer. The next humiliation landed the morning of the event. I arrived early, as planned, to oversee final preparations. I always arrive early. It's habit, control disguised as professionalism. As I checked in with the event manager, Maris appeared beside us, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Oh, good," she said brightly. "You're here." Then, to the manager, "She's with staff. You can give her the server badge." The manager hesitated, looked at me, looked back at Maris. I said nothing. The badge was clipped to my blazer. Server access. No name. No title. Just a laminated reminder of where they thought I belonged. That moment didn't sting the way they probably expected it to. It clarified something. From then on, the night unfolded like a controlled experiment in degradation. Maris corrected my posture when I passed her table, asked me to refill water she hadn't touched, commented loudly on how humbling service work must be. My parents laughed nervously. Complicit through silence. Ethan avoided my eyes completely. And then came the watch. I noticed it halfway through dinner. Maris lifted her wrist to gesture dramatically while telling a story about Monaco. And there it was, my grandmother's watch. The Art Deco face. The tiny diamond at 12 o'clock. The faint scratch near the clasp from when she'd dropped it on her kitchen tile. My lungs locked. I stared. Too long. Maris noticed. She smiled and extended her wrist, enjoying the attention. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. "Ethan gave it to me. A family heirloom." I looked at my brother. He stared at his plate. My grandmother had pressed that watch into my hand days before she died. She'd told me to keep it safe. She'd told me it was mine. Ethan had never asked for it. He'd simply taken it using the spare key no one ever questioned him for having. And now he'd given it away. Not sold it. Not pawned it. Handed it to a woman who treated it like an accessory. Something inside me went very still. The final act came after dessert. Montgomery Calloway cleared his throat and stood, glass raised. He spoke about unity, about trust, about building legacies together. Then, without looking at me, he slid a folder across the table toward Ethan. Inside was the investment proposal, the one I'd already flagged, the one Daniel Ross had been waiting for. They talked numbers, returns, urgency. The language was predatory, now direct. Unmasked. Ethan faltered. "I don't have that kind of liquid capital," he admitted. Silence. Then my mother's hand landed on his arm. "Sweetheart," she said softly. "This is your future." Maris leaned in. Sometimes families help each other take leaps. All eyes turned to me. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The message was clear. Fix this. I felt the weight of it, the years of expectation. The quiet conditioning. The unspoken rule that I existed to absorb impact so others wouldn't have to. Ethan looked at me then. Desperate. Hopeful. And something snapped. Not explosively. Cleanly. "I can help," I said. Their relief was immediate, visible, almost obscene. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the debit card I'd placed there weeks earlier, the one Daniel Ross had approved. The one wired into a monitored account. I was saving for a condo. I added, letting my voice soften. "But family comes first." "Right." Ethan whispered my name like a prayer. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was sure. No one protected me. That was the moment. Standing there, surrounded by people smiling at my sacrifice. Watching a woman wear my grandmother's watch while planning to drain my savings. I finally understood the truth. This wasn't thoughtlessness. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't bad timing. This was not an accident. It was a plan. Once I said yes, everything changed. Not in the way they expected, but in the way people reveal themselves when they believe the outcome is secured. Maurice relaxed. Completely. The brittle charm softened into something warmer, almost indulgent. She stopped posturing and started instructing where to sit, when to smile, which photos would be acceptable for social media. Montgomery grew generous with details he'd carefully avoided before, explaining timelines and offshore partners with the casual confidence of a man who thought the door was already locked behind him. My parents looked relieved in a way that made my chest ache. Not relieved for me, relieved by me. Ethan barely spoke. He kept glancing at me like I'd just rescued him from a burning building, never questioning why he'd been so willing to let me run into the fire alone. I smiled. I nodded. I played the part they needed. And then, quietly, I began to pull everything back. The first step was administrative. 2 hours before the investment processing, I sent 3 emails short. Professional. Unemotional. The first went to my bank. This transaction is authorized. Please flag the account for federal compliance review per prior instructions. The second went to my legal team. Proceed with suspension of all discretionary family support, effective immediately. No notice required. The third went to Daniel Ross. We're moving forward. All conditions met. He replied less than a minute later. Understood. We're live. That was it. No dramatic speeches. No confrontations. No warning shots. Revenge, I'd learned, is most effective when it looks like routine. While the Callaways finalized their pitch at the table, I excused myself under the guise of work. I stepped into the private office adjacent to the event space, the one I used for high net worth negotiations. The one no one in my family had ever been invited into. I closed the door, and I breathed. For the first time all evening, my hands were steady. I opened my laptop and reviewed the documents one last time. The contracts I'd signed weeks earlier, the escrow confirmations, the holding company filings, the building my parents lived in purchased quietly, legally, without fanfare. The trust I'd established for my grandmother's remaining assets protected, isolated, unreachable. The clause that terminated all informal financial assistance to immediate family members once a material breach of trust occurred. That breach had already happened. They just didn't know it yet. When I returned to the table, the energy had shifted again. The Callaways were circling closer. Their language grew sharper, more urgent. Montgomery produced the card reader with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before. That was when Margaret's lawyer, Helen Cho, arrived. She wasn't on the guest list. She wasn't meant to be. She was 82 years old, impeccably dressed, posture straight as a ruler. She'd been my grandmother's closest friend and executor, quiet, terrifyingly competent, and utterly uninterested in anyone's opinion. She walked directly to me and took my hand. "You ready?" she asked softly. I nodded. Her presence did something unexpected to me. It steadied me in a way nothing else had. Like my grandmother had reached across time and placed her palm between my shoulder blades. The Callaways noticed her immediately. Montgomery frowned. "And you are." Helen smiled politely. "Irrelevant to you." I almost laughed. I let the transaction proceed. I let the card reader beep. I let the receipt print. I let the silence settle when Montgomery tried to move the money and couldn't. I let the room fill with confusion, then tension, then fear. When Daniel Ross stood up and identified himself, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Because in that moment, watching everything they'd built collapse in on itself, I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished. The arrests were efficient, almost boring. The Callaways protested just enough to embarrass themselves. Ethan cried. My parents looked like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. And through it all, I stayed calm. After the room emptied, after the agents left and the adrenaline drained away, Helen remained. She sat beside me, reached into her bag, and placed something in my palm. My grandmother's watch, recovered earlier that day. Serial number matched. Documentation airtight. Your brother tried to contest ownership, Helen said. It didn't go well for him. I closed my fingers around it. Something inside my chest finally unclenched. You did exactly what she hoped you would, Helen added. You protected yourself. That night didn't end with shouting or reconciliation. It ended with quiet. With emails already sent, with accounts frozen, with expectations permanently reset. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. Clear about who I was. Clear about what I owed. Clear about what I never would again. And for the first time in my life, the power in the room wasn't borrowed. It was mine. The moment Daniel Ross identified himself, the room stopped pretending. I'm with the Financial Crimes Task Force, he said calmly, badge already in hand. This event is now part of an active federal investigation. For half a second, no one reacted. Then everything happened at once. My mother stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is insane, she said, voice high and brittle. There must be some mistake. Montgomery Calloway didn't speak. He didn't need to. I saw it in his eyes, the rapid calculations, the mental inventory of exit routes, assets, excuses. A man like him doesn't panic loudly. He compresses. Morris, on the other hand, exploded. You set us up, she snapped, pointing at me, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You lying. Miserable. Sit down, Ross said, not raising his voice. Two men in dark jackets appeared at the edge of the room like they'd always been there. The kind of presence you don't notice until it's too late. Ethan pushed back from the table. Wait, what's happening? He demanded. Looking between Ross and me, Eleanor. What did you do? I met his eyes. I told the truth, I said. That landed harder than any accusation. Ross motioned to Montgomery. Sir, we need you to place your hands on the table. Montgomery did, slowly, like a man indulging a formality. This is highly irregular, he said smoothly. I want my attorney. You'll get one, Ross replied. After we finish here. Maris laughed, sharp and disbelieving. You can't arrest us over dinner. Ross nodded once, almost sympathetic. Normally, no. But tonight, you accepted funds from a U.S. citizen under false pretenses, using interstate wire systems, while under active investigation for financial fraud. He glanced at me. That was the predicate act. My father's face drained of color. Predicate act. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan staggered back into his chair. You wore a wire, he whispered. I didn't answer him. Two agents stepped forward and cuffed Montgomery. The metallic click echoed louder than the music that was still playing somewhere outside the private room. Maris screamed. Not a refined gasp or a shocked cry. A full, raw scream, the sound of someone watching control evaporate. You stupid girl. She shrieked at me. You ruined everything. I stood, slowly, deliberately. I straightened my jacket, smoothed the fabric, took one step forward so there was no confusion about who I was addressing. No, I said calmly. You ruined yourselves. She tried to lunge at me. An agent restrained her instantly, gripping her arms with practiced ease. This is entrapment, she spat. You manipulated us. Ross didn't even look at her. That's not what entrapment means. My mother turned to me then, eyes wide and wet. Eleanor, she whispered, please, tell them this is a misunderstanding. I looked at her, really looked, at the woman who'd taught me to apologize for taking up space, who'd watched me be sidelined again and again because it was easier than standing up for me. This was not a misunderstanding, I said quietly. It was a pattern. Montgomery was on his feet now, flanked by agents, for the first time. His composure cracked. "You think this ends well for you?" he hissed at me. "You think your family walks away clean?" I smiled, not cruelly. "Clearly. My family doesn't walk away at all." I said, "That's the point." That was when Helen Cho stepped forward. She hadn't said a word until now. She placed a slim folder on the table and slid it toward Ross. "You'll find additional documentation there," she said evenly. "Estate records, unauthorized transfer of property, and proof of coercion involving a family heirloom." Maris froze. "What heirloom?" she demanded. I reached out gently and turned her wrist upward. "The watch. My grandmother's watch. This one," I said. The agent holding her glanced down, then back up at Ross. Ross nodded once. "Add theft to the report." Ethan made a strangled sound. "I didn't steal it," he said desperately. "I just borrowed it." "For someone else," Helen replied. "Without consent. After the owner's death. That's theft." The room felt smaller, hotter, like the walls were inching inward. The agents began escorting the Callaways toward the exit. Maris fought until she couldn't anymore, her heels skidding uselessly against the floor. As she passed me, she leaned close and hissed, "You'll end up alone." I leaned in just enough for her to hear me. "I already was." I said, "Now I'm free." The doors closed behind them. Silence rushed in, thick, deafening. Ethan broke first. He stood, tears streaking down his face, hands shaking. "I didn't know," he said again, voice cracking. "You have to believe me. I didn't know." I looked at my brother, the man who'd always needed saving, who'd always assumed someone else would pay the cost. "I believe you didn't ask." I said, "That's not the same thing." My father slumped into his chair. My mother sank beside him, hands covering her face. Ross gathered his things. "We'll be in touch," he said to me. "Thank you for your cooperation." I nodded. "We're done." He paused at the door. "You handled yourself well." Then he was gone. The room felt hollow without the performance. I picked up my bag. Ethan looked up at me, eyes desperate. "You're not leaving." "I am," I said. "You can't just walk away from us." I turned to him. "This is me walking toward myself," I said. "You should try it sometime." And with that, I walked out. He didn't follow. No one did. The fallout was quiet, but it was everywhere. Within 48 hours, the Callaway name disappeared from polite conversation like it had never existed. Charity boards quietly removed bios. Social media accounts went dark. The kind of people who once leaned in to hear Maris speak now leaned away, afraid association itself might be contagious. My parents stopped calling. At first, I thought it was shock. Then I realized it was something else. They had no leverage left. Ethan was questioned for weeks. Nothing stuck hard enough to charge him, but enough to stain him permanently. Employers stopped returning his emails. Friends stopped inviting him out. For the first time in his life, no one stepped in to cushion the fall. Helen handled the rest. My grandmother's remaining assets were transferred cleanly into a protected trust. The watch came back to me, ticking steadily like it always had, indifferent to chaos. I moved my parents out of the brownstone when the notice period ended professionally. Legally. Without argument. They didn't fight it. I think they finally understood there was no performance left to play. And then there was me. I didn't throw a party. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post a victory photo or make a statement. I went quiet. I took a month off. Closed one venue, sold another, streamlined my company down to what actually mattered. I spent mornings walking instead of managing. I ate meals without checking my phone. I slept. For the first time, my life didn't revolve around proving something to people who would never see me. I moved into my penthouse on a rainy Tuesday. No champagne. No guests. Just keys in my hand and a sense of arrival I'd never felt before. That night, I placed my grandmother's watch on the nightstand and listened to it tick. It sounded like permission, Permission to stop fixing what never wanted to be healed. Permission to stop shrinking so others could feel tall. Permission to build a future that didn't require anyone else's approval. My family didn't collapse because I walked away. They collapsed because they'd been leaning on me without ever asking if I could hold the weight. I didn't destroy them. I stepped out of the role that kept them pretending. And in doing so, I finally became something they never allowed me to be. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you've been overgiving. And if you've ever had to choose between loyalty and self-respect, you already know which one saves you in the end.